The second book of Achee, chapter 5. An account of the creation of the earth. And it came to pass that the righteous people of Suriname continued on into their journeys until they arrived upon the land of promise in the regions of Tanin. And they made lairs for their families to dwell in, and to be shaded from the heat of the day. And they began to till the earth, and Sephora put into the ground one half of the seed she had brought. And it came to pass, after Shavuot was firmly established upon the promised land, and the blessing of it was known to all the Erkadoshi, according to the manner that it has been written. The Lord drew near unto them, and called out unto Achee. And the Lord said, Achee, my friend, get yourself up upon the high places of the east, so that you may survey and look upon the land of promise, for I have somewhat to tell you concerning the creation of the world. And now it had come to pass that soon after their arrival, some of the young men had journeyed up upon the mountains to the east, and they had discovered in the springtime of their first arrival beasts that walked upon the mountains, and they caught some of them when they were yet young, and at the first sight of their mothers, and they calmed them, and they brought them home, and they taught them to carry their burdens for them, and the women used their hair for wool. And it came to pass, Sephora preserved some of the skins of these animals, for to cover, to store away the heavenly tablets of the Lord. Therefore the young men began to call these beasts kumas, and that is to say, tablet beasts. And it came to pass that in those days Achee and his rib began to be old, and when the Lord called him to rise up to get himself upon the eastern high places, he took kumas to carry that which he and his rib must bear, and their burdens for their journey, and their son Padu went with them. For he was one who had taught the kumas to carry burdens, and it was in the heat of summer, 9 seasons in the time of their arrival, and yet toward the east whereunto the Lord had called them. Now it was hot above the shore by the rock of Tanin, but it grew cooler as they ascended upon the heights. And when they were come to the place that they could behold, the land of promise stretched far out before their eyes, and they sought to establish themselves for a time. And it came to pass that they found a cavity in a rock, and they made it into a lair, and there was water in the cavity of the rock, and a pinnacle stretched outward westward from before the lair, and they could go out there amidst the rocks, and gaze upon the far reaches of the land, even down into the land of Tanin and the great sea. And they would go out upon the pinnacle to say their morning and evening prayers, and the rising and the setting of the sun. And Achee built an altar to the Lord there, so he may inquire diligently as to that which the Lord desired of him. And it came to pass that Achee was thus engaged in prayer early one morning. The presence of Messiah drew near, and the earth began to shake, and Sephora and Padu got themselves out of the cavity of the rock, and behold, a great mountain to the east of them broke asunder, and it belched forth fire and smoke, and the cinders of brimstone, and all the Erkadoshi stood quiet in wonder of it. And when it happened, Achee turned himself to look, and a voice out of the fire called to him. And Achee exclaimed, O Lord, here I am. And it came to pass that the Lord spake to him, but Achee saw him not, and the smoke of the burning filled the lofty places. And the Lord said, I come this day, so that you may be drawn to an understanding concerning all of my doings and the days of creations. And you shall write them all that comes before your eyes, for it is my will that the righteous during the domination of the Decadar come to an understanding concerning the great love of my Father, and also of my compassion that can redeem them, and call out to them, and cause them to find comfort when they mourn, also a great need for them to love me. And when the Lord had said these things, a wondrous sight opened up before the eyes of Achee, and all his eyes could see the handiwork of the love of God. And a voice said, Look and see, O man, for which is before you is the home of all mankind, and the only home man will ever know. And it came to pass that Achee saw the earth with new eyes, and it was a marvelous thing to him. For he walked daily among the Erkadarshi, but this time his eyes were open, and he saw all the earth, yea, even all the Erkadarshi, came alive before him, and they appeared as if they were moving about, and they were all in the act of praising God and singing and dancing. And he stood affixed at the wonder. And he stood affixed at the wonder of which that he saw. And again the mountain burst forth in great roaring and fire and smoke. And Achee heard a voice speaking to him from out of the midst of the fire. And at this time, because his eyes were open, he knew whose voice it was, and he knew it was the voice of Debrael, who was the watcher of the presence, and he spoke in heavenly council that he had witnessed in Cermak by the pools of salt, and it was the watcher who had spoken of the desire for Messiah to be in the midst of all the element with God and man, and the Erkadarshi. And the watcher spoke great and lofty precepts to him, for he said, Know, O man of flesh, that man came to be in the midst of all of the forms of the elements of creation have taken by the great wonder of the creating hand of the love of the Father. For the great Holy One placed the soul of every man in the midst of all things. And also know that Messiah put his Father into the midst of all things by the power of Jezreel, and all the loving kindness of the Father dwells there because of him. And know again that man put Messiah into the midst of all the elements of the earth, that they found form by the covenant of Shabuah, and all the elements of the earth who are to be found faithful have to reside in them because of man, and the souls of these three reside in all the elements where the Erkadarshi dwell, and the souls of the Erkadarshi are brought into Messiah because of God, and they find life for their souls because of Messiah, and they find fulfillment of their purpose because of man. But the Erkadarshi rejected the pleas of Melchizedek that Messiah should dwell in them, and they would not go worship the image of God, nor would they choose to find value in his great love, so that man would dwell in them. And thus, for all the days of the earth, they have brought death rather than life to all those they see, and they would not love Messiah or man in their midst, insomuch they fell away from God, and they lost their first station. And because of that falling away, they cannot know the severity of their error, when they also reject the presence of the loving kindness of the Father in them, that is put there by the power of Messiah with his gifts of Jezreel. And because the Father is mild in their eyes, they shall not think to expel him unto the end. But as of now, the souls of men are not resident with them, in the same manner as Messiah is absent. And in this way, the welfare of the souls of men is filled with a dark place within the Erkadarshi. And because of this, neither man nor Messiah in the midst of any Erkadarshi, and they care nothing whatsoever for any man, even man who was worthy. But because all power is given to the Son, they cannot escape the power of Jezreel, nor the excellence of the law of virtue that sprung forth out of the hand of Messiah in his gifts. And because of this, the great Holy One ever resides in all the Erkadarshi, yea, even every one of them. And if it were not so, they would not have any place on the earth to dwell. And they take great delight in seeing it rains, and just as the unjust, for in this way they are always nourished unto life. But in tribulation times, when the Erkadarshi will draw their support from them, they are cast to the earth. Their wickedness shall come to full, And the day will come that in the great blindness of their age they will at last reject the power of the presence of my Father, and they shall find at last no place in the midst of the elements of the heavens or the earth, because they are then void of any form of connection to life they could have had in the midst of the element. And there are many men who will follow after them in their manner and in all their likeness, who will also find no place to dwell when all the things are made new, and they have eternal death rather than eternal life, and they die as the things pertaining to righteousness. But rejoice, as for all the Erkadarshi they have chosen to love the tender Father, and his loving kindness is ever in them, and through them, and round about them, and they have chosen to embrace the good and the dwelling being of all men who are the object of creation. Notwithstanding, they also will withdraw their support from the wicked among men, and it will be the cause of their great tribulations. But all the souls of the righteousness will ever find comfort to know that they dwell in them, and that they have cherished with diligence, and have honor to submit themselves willingly to the God of Shabuah, and they ever speak in behalf of Messiah, and they always act for his blessing, and they only desire that which will benefit him, and for all this they shall obtain eternal life, and thus are known in heaven and among the lofty righteous of the earth as the watchers of the presence. And it is they who shall inherit eternal life, together with all those who keep the law, and do the works of righteousness, and repentance. And the man who is worthy is foremost among all the angels of the presence of God, and we know he is Messiah. And all the leaders of the Erkadarshi are prominent among the angels of the presence in heaven and upon the earth. And the brothers of all the Erkadarshi are also widely known as the watchers of the presence by the heavenly hosts, as well as the righteous of the earth, who have obtained eternal life. And it came to pass that Achee, upon hearing all these things, began to think back upon all he heard beside the pools of salt concerning the council of heaven. And he remembered, he heard watchers conversing in the council that took place in the day before the beginning, and he exclaimed to Dabrael, how can these things be? There can be those in heaven who were created when all things were made, and yet it can be in a day before creation. And the watcher answered him, and he said, know of certainty, the Messiah is timeless and eternal before the face of God, because he is God. And he was called the Son of God because he dwelt in the form of human flesh in order to redeem all mankind. Thus, the humanhood of God through the Son is inherently a part of the soul of God and his Son, because his Son is ever present before him, with no beginning and no end. And Messiah is timeless and eternal before the face of men, because he is in and through all the forms, the element that has taken upon the earth, all men dwells, and they are called the Erkadarshi. And it is because of this that Messiah also resides in every present moment with all men, to love them, to counsel them, and to direct their paths in the ways of God. And because God became a man of flesh, and because God came a man of flesh, the humanhood of man and the image of God is inherently a part of the soul of man. And in this way, Messiah is both the beginning and the end for all the souls of men, for he encompasses all the eternity within man must dwell, and he has defined that eternity with the vision of created purpose each day of every human soul. And the watchers of the presence, who you saw in the first council of heaven that was held before the beginning, are the living spirits that reside in all the forms that the element has taken among the Erkadarshi, because of the eternal nature of the Son, and because they are like unto the Son, they can supersede the day of their creation. For because he is God, and he chose to walk in the flesh to redeem all mankind who will, and because of the Ergadershi, and then the repentant among men, always allow him entry into their souls. They have become like the watchers of the presence, as by their obedience they have taken upon themselves his eternal nature, and have not a being of days nor an end of days, even in the same manner as him. And because God in the Son is a man of the flesh and blood, he ever he ever has need to be in the midst of all the Erkadershi. For because God for because God became a man, he a necessity must have a place to dwell, and his soul requires nourishment from the spirit that comes out of all the forms of the element have taken by the wonderful love of his Father. And because his humanhood is eternal, there is no condition in which he does not have to need to be sustained in his humanhood in the midst of the Erkadershi. Therefore, they are always with him, and they are called the watchers of the presence, and every day before they were created. And it came to pass that the watchers of holiness were explained to Achee in a way that was clearer than ever known. And the watcher inscribed first said, I am the one who was known in heaven as the watcher of the presence of God, and I am fire, and I am called Debariel. Messiah has need to be in the company with me so that he may speak the words of God. And he needs the wind, who is called Rahavael, so that he can see through the eyes of God. And he needs the mountains, who are called Malachi, so that he can accomplish the reign of God. And he must have all of the rocks of the Erkadershi, who are called Ebadel, so from he can gain strength to be the servant of God. And Messiah loves to be near the thunder, who is called Yatzal, so that he can show forth the coming of God. For he has not said that if you have seen me, then you have seen the Father. And he loves the trees, who are Kabodayah, for he desires to ever show forth the glory of God. And Messiah dearly loves the rain, who is called Barakael, for his heart is delighted, because God has blessed all of his children. And he has the feet of man who walks upon the hills, who are called Regal, for they take great delight in the feet of God. And it gave him satisfaction to be purified in the river of Jordan, for all the rivers are called Panal, for they always show forth the very face of God. As he loves to behold the clouds of the heavens, who are called Abrael, for they show forth in him the passing of God. And in his tender heart Messiah he loves to walk with the dew of heaven, who is called Anahiel. For in the dew of the grass he knows the gentleness of God, and the grass he also knows the washing of God, and the grass is called Rachatel. And when he suffers in his sorrows, he always comforted in the mighty oceans, who are called Sarael, for they show forth him in the great power of God. And because he is the light of the world, he is known as the light of truth. He ever and always finds a companion in the Son, who is called Oriel, for the Messiah is the light of God, and the fountains of the earth are the loving friends to Messiah, because resident in him is the life of God, and he could be lonely without all the animals, who are called Shemael, as they show forth in him the work of God. And Messiah always does the work of God. And the heart of Messiah often finds the delight of God in all the fruits of the earth, and they are called Shephatiel. And Messiah is kind to the moon, because she reflects the light of God, and the moon is called Amethythiel. And In the moon, Messiah finds companionship to show the world the truth of God, and he is obedient to his Father to keep the times of God, which is that the division of days is called by Enoch, and the times are named by Ahadiel. And Messiah is man who is the Redeemer of the world, and he loves the springtime, who is called Chadashael, for it shows forth him and the renewal of God. And Messiah always has the joy of living in the summertime, who is called Achee, for she brings to his mind all the delights of the happiness of God. And Messiah is obedient to attend the needs of all the children of the Father. Therefore, he loves to be near the fall time, who is called Gavael, for in her the gathering of God is accomplished. And Messiah is obedient to keep the Sabbath, and he loves the winter, who is called Shabbathael, for he is comforted by the rest of God. And he would always lonesome to be without the stars, who are called Rashaphael, for in them he ever bears witness to the movement of God. And because of all the leaders of the watchers are faithful to him, from in the midst of eternity they stand among the prominent, and all of the watchers of the presence, and he needs for them to dwell with him eternally, for he is man who must have them as a home to dwell in, and all those who find life eternal are like him in this way, and they too must dwell among the Erkadoshi in the midst of eternity. And it is because of this that there is a new heaven and a new earth which rises up in purity to roll upon the wings in the midst of the light that proceeds forth from the very face of God. And it came to pass that all these things came to mind of Achee in an instant, and when he beheld the arm of the Lord, and the Lord spake to him by the voice of Debrael, and Achee had known from his grandfather all the names of the Erkadershi, but he had not known that they were prominent among the watchers of present, who stand in the midst of eternity. And he knew it not, that the arm of the Lord that had opened up before him, and the love of God that is resident in the elements of the earth, was powerful nearly unto the overcoming of his soul. And Achee could do nothing but weep for joy. And in the midst of it he cried out for the outpouring of his heart. And he called out to Messiah, for his overflowing love could not be contained. And he beheld the Messiah was in the shaking of the earth, and he was in the flashing of the lightning that streaked across the heavens, and he was in the face of the clouds, and in the sound of the thunder. And it came to pass that he heard a voice like of Messiah, and he was speaking kindly to him, and beckoning him to look. And Achee looked, and the watcher who was filled with delight stood beside him. And she said, there are 3 parts to creation, and I am sent to declare the first to you. And all the 3 parts of creation are indeed a marvelous work and a wonder, and a miracle of them will become known to all the righteous in some future day. And every eye shall see, and every tongue confess, after the judgment of the last day, that because of the mighty deeds that you will see, all his judgments are just, and all those who receive eternal life will rejoice with him without end. And when she had said these things, a vision of Sephora and the day of her creation opened up before the eyes of Achee, and he taught himself, the Lord loves me, and he is going to spare me sorrows of viewing again the creation of visions of my loved ones in the land of Shinar. And he heard again the loving voice of Messiah, pleading his persuasions in her behalf. And he heard again the Father say, oh, what a happy day for me. Let us not delay to make this one, who we shall call Sephora. And immediately there appeared the soul of a woman standing in the purity in the midst of the light of God. And Achee beheld it again. And it came to pass that the watcher said, As you stood and behold again the wondrous sight, the eyes of God are looking upon this woman, and the eyes of the Son are also looking upon her. And while the eyes of the Son are seeing her, the soul of Sephora, who was in the first gift of judgment of his father, he is also bestowing all of the rest of the gifts of judgment upon her father in her behalf, according to the needs of his father. And the love of the father ever grows and flows out of him as he views her and contemplates the gifts of judgment, as these gifts are given to him because of the love of Messiah has for both her and his father. And as the great Holy One looks upon her while considering these things, his wondrous love begins to perform its handiwork in her behalf. And because of the grace of Messiah and in the heart of God, he loves her and respects her, and he desires to preserve her ability to decide in his desire, and he has called up out of the midst of his soul the ability for a human soul to choose whether or not to see his face, and this is called darkness. And he covered the face of the deep with darkness, and in this way the brightness of the face of God did not intrude upon the meekness of the soul of Sephora. And all the face of the deep stood in amazement at a new wonder of respect for Sephora that now covered it, because of the love of God had for this woman. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters that that they were without form in the midst of the deep, and God stood fastly upon the soul that he had just made, and he said, I must have a place for myself in the midst of eternity, so that I may dwell with this my lovely one. And there appeared a place of light, and in the midst of the darkness that covered the face of the deep, and God called it heaven. And all of the spirit of the deep stood and marveled. And now the very eternal God could find a place of his presence to dwell, for God is timeless and eternal, and there never was any place that could hold him. At the face of the deep, and the face of the deep looked upon Sephora and said, who can this soul be, that the great Holy One, who hitherto has needed no place, has now found a place for his soul to dwell, to be with her? And the deep knew that it held a very great treasure for God in the soul of Sephora. Wow. And as God considered Sephora, he knew that if there was a spiritual darkness, then there must also be a spiritual light that can only be seen by her choice. And he said, let there be light. And his love abused itself, and there was light, and the spirit of the deep rejoiced to see it. And God saw the light shone in the darkness. And it came to pass that after these things Messiah presented his fourth gift unto his father. And God said, if I now have wherein I may dwell with this lovely one of mine, then also must have a dwelling place of the soul of the earth immediately appeared in the light of God, standing in her purity. And the earth was without form and void, and the spiritual light encompassed about it, and the shadow of the light could not be found. And the morning and the evening were the first day. And these four things did God make on the first day. And he looked upon his lovely one. And it came to pass that after these things God continued to gaze upon the soul of Sephora. And he sat pondering in his heart as to which he could choose to do for her, in his love for her. And he said at last, I must fill her abode with the lives of wondrous spirits, and they must be delightful and holy creations that can find the joy of love of life for her sake. And his spirit moved upon the face of the waters, and immediately there appeared in the light of God all the spirits of the watchers of the presence where the souls are eternal, and who would be ever faithful and true. And immediately all the living spirits of the leaders of the Erkadershi thronged about the soul of Sephora with a bond and love for her that rose out of the great heart of God. And God said, "What a joy is it to me to bestow such blessings and witness upon her. Surely these 24 faithful ones will need those who will follow them and come to their aid, who will also bless this my lovely one." And again, immediately there appeared in the light of God all the spirits of the watchers of the earth, and the spirit of the deep was greatly moved upon, for the richness of the love of God for the soul of this woman. And it came to pass that Messiah gave unto his father his second gift in judgment, and God said, "It will not do, for all these spirits have now found life, to just be nothing more than near to my lovely one. They must speak to her of my love for her always, and they must always speak to her of their love for her whenever they may say. She will know that her dwelling place will always be known to her." As one that loves and cherishes her. And immediately in the midst of the light of God there was heard voices speaking to the glory of God, and telling of the way, and singing, and a great tender resounding and great and tender resoundings were heard to bestir themselves before the face of the deep. And the morning and the evening were the second day. And God created these three things on the second day. And the handiwork of his love for her could not be stayed, for it surged and it rolled and it leaped with happiness at the sight of the wonderful gift of Sephora. And this was before the eyes of God. And God again sat himself, and he pondered to find what further rich gifts of love could he do in her behalf. And it came to pass that Messiah bestowed his eighth gift of judgment upon the Father. And God said, "The earth which is her home must have strong and steadfast companions to support it, and to give it seasons and months and days and years. And so I may delight in the joys of her in her passages." And immediately the sun appeared in the light that issued forth in the midst of the love of God, and it rolled upon the wings of the midst of the heaven, and in the spiritual light of it shone upon the earth, and still had no form, and it was void, and the light of it flooded upon the face of the surface of the earth to warm it and to sustain it, and bring it comfort and to nourish it. And God said, "I must also have a little light to keep for a company, and to speak gentle things to her soul in the shadow of the night." And immediately the spirit of the moon appeared in the light of the presence of God, and she was standing in her purity, as she reflected the light of the sun in the shadow of the night, and it was to bring comfort to all the hosts of the watchers and the lovely one of God. And God said, "I must have great hosts of lights in the night, to always speak to my Sephora, that I am ever near, and the truth of my love is moving about her in the ways that are too vast to number." And immediately the spirits and the stars were seen in the light of the presence of God, standing according to their hosts in all purity. And God was well satisfied. In the morning and the evening were the third day. And God made these three things in the third day. And he sat again, looking upon the lovely soul of Sephora, pondering in his heart. And it came to pass that Messiah bestowed his 11th gift upon his father. And it came to pass that he arose in the joy of his delight, and he exclaimed, "I shall make many lovely things for her, and she shall have a sweet smell, and they shall be delicious for her to eat, and they shall bring her many comforts of well-being, and they shall be a place for her feet to walk, and her legs to run, and there shall be wind to blow across her, and clouds to bring her the joys of delights. And immediately in the light of his presence there appeared dry land, and out of the midst of the sea, and they stretched forth across his eyes, and it stood in holy purity. And it came to pass that Messiah bestowed upon his father his 12th gift. And God said, let the earth bring forth waters in abundance, and let them bubble up and flow over and be gathered into one place. And immediately they appeared in the light of the presence of God, pure fountains of water and streams rushing happily into the sea. And the seas also appeared, and they danced and they jumped, and they rolled with the abundant energy, and they received from the love of God for Tephora. All the waters were happy, and they all moved about in the wonderment of their joy, and the heart of God was well pleased. And it came to pass that Messiah bestowed his ninth gift upon his father. And God said, let there appear growing multitudes that ever sing of my purity to this my lovely one. And God saw his abounding purity cover the hills and the plains, and the plain with the mantle. And immediately there appeared multitude of grasses upon the plain, waving in their purity in the light of God. Also the herbs of the field were there to whisper wise counsel to the lovely one of God concerning the diligent care of her and her loved ones. And it came to pass that Messiah bestowed his 7th gift of judgment upon his father, and let there be fruit trees bearing fruit, and delectable things for the soul of my lovely one, and let each have seed that they can bear. And immediately the forests of the earth appeared, standing and spreading forth their love and their purity in the light of God. And they have delicate and smooth shade, and spirits yearn to bear fruit for the lovely one of God, who was called Tephora. And the joy of it was great, insomuch that the wonderful chorus of singing was heard to resound within the soul of the deep, and she was made glad, and her barrenness was healed, and all life in her was a treasure she held close to her bosom. And the morning and the evening were the 4th day. And God walked in the grass in the field, and he stood in the shade of his delectable trees, and he was well satisfied at the wondrous gifts that his love had made for Tephora. And the grasses were made glad, and the hills rejoiced, and the wind sang a new song of happiness. And God made these 5 things on the 4th day. And God sat upon the grass that he had made. He looked upon his lovely Tephora, and he pondered yet again what he could do for her. And it came to pass that Messiah gave his 6th gift unto his father. And God called out in his loving kindness to the streams of waters, to the hills, and to the grass of the field, and to the trees of the forest. And he said, I shall make companions for you, so that you may have the nourishment of their companion, for the sake of this my lovely one. For it is my desire that you always go about to bless Tephora. And immediately the light of God there appeared a host of the spirits of many kinds of water creatures and great whales, who are called tannin, and fish of all kinds, began to assemble in great numbers and swim happily about. And the winds that danced upon the waters over the hills, there appeared the spirits of the multitudes of the birds and the fowls of the air, and the voices of the watchers were heard in abundance, and they sang of the Holy One of the lovely one of God. And the morning and the evening were the 5th day. And God made these things on the fifth day. And God yet pondered in his heart to discover what he might do for his lovely Sephora. And it came to pass that Messiah gave his third gift to his father. And God said, I shall make companions for her, to bless her when she is lonely, to help her when she is weary, and to look after her welfare. And immediately upon the grassy hills and beside the waters, under the gentle shade of the trees, there appeared in the light of God a multitude of spirits of animals, and they appeared each in their kind, and they were delightful to behold, and there bore witness of the loving and kindness of God. And it came to pass that Messiah gave his 10th gift to his father. And God said, here is the object of my love. And he pointed to the soul of Sephora, standing in purity. And immediately there appeared in the light of his presence all the cattle, the herds, and the flocks, and the creatures of the fields. And they were all filled with the love of God, and they all stood in the purity in the presence of God. And the earth was filled with the love of these things, and all the life that he made on the sixth day. He looked upon his lovely Sephora, and accordingly they all bore witness of his delight in his most precious gift. And they had eyes and ears and legs, and they had breath in their chests, because she did. And their desire was to be in her likeness, she being the first flesh upon the earth. And there were voices that were heard to be saying in the midst of all of the life upon the earth, that surely it is so, that the lovely one of God is why we live and move and have our being. And it came to pass that Messiah gave his last gift to his father. And God said, there is yet one more thing I must do for Sephora. I will place her spirit in the midst of all this, my handiwork, for her to dwell in. And immediately the soul of Sephora could be known and seen by all the hosts of heaven. And she will be born a rib and a little baby upon the earth, in the midst of the loving kindness of God, and in the midst of all the forms of the element that had taken because of the love of God for her. And the morning and the evening were the sixth day. And God made these four things on the sixth day, and these altogether were the 22 great things that were the great works of God in creation. And after the 22 things had transpired in creation, the number became the element of righteousness to make changes and established great precedents in the earth, which stands in the midst of the deep. And thus was the spiritual creation of all things completed. All the spirits of the course of the earth were created and made in 6 days, and it is all done in Elda, which is the great abode of God. And there was not yet ground for man to till, for the elements as yet had no form, but were spiritual in a day, the first part of their creation. And after these 22 things had sprung forth out of his love for Sephora, the face of the deep would never be the same again, forever in all eternity. And it came to pass that after all these things, God saw that his boundless love had borne fruit to the fullest, and he was weary from all his pondering to find ways to love Sephora. And God saw that all he had done for her was good, and it would surely come to full, and there could be no more that could be made for her, for his handiwork utterly fulfilled the earth and all the ways that he loved her, and there was no place upon it that did not know life in her behalf, and all creation And all creation was the dwelling place of the soul of Tephora, and there was no place where there was not life. And the life that came forth out of the love of God for her abounded, and an overflowing and rich desire of the Father to be with his lovely one was the fabric of all creation. And it came to pass that God rested upon the seventh day, and from all his labors to find ways to love the poor. And God was well satisfied that the place of his abode was filled with a myriad and forms of love for her to greet her soul every day of her life. And the watcher said to Achee, "You have seen the first part of the creation that is now complete, and that in 6 days it has been done. And you have seen that the love of God for the soul of your rib is so utterly complete that the great Holy One must rest himself. And know also that these things you have seen this day will be done in the same way, and in the same intensity, and in the same completeness for every human soul that finds breath upon the earth. And the vision that went upon your eyes is accomplished when he looks upon each and every human soul, as it is to him as though he has only one person to create all the earth for. And each and every vision that is spoken to God by his Son gives him a new delight, a reason to create all that exists. So great is his love for each one. And it came to pass that Achee was astonished, and he said, Surely the love of God is for each of all of the children of men is more than my poor soul can bear to comprehend. And the light of the presence of God shone forth from the face of Achee. And when all these things were done, the watcher who was filled with the light departed. And another watcher came to stand by him, who was filled with the spirit of joining of Eve, and said, I have come to show you with the second part of creation, and then the first part of creation. The love of God put souls of all men into the spirits of all life that is in creation, and all of the life upon the earth in behalf of each soul in their uniqueness. And it is spiritual in the day that the Father created the spirit of life for each one. And all of this was before the elements of the earth were made to be in their natural form. And the elements of the natural earth were without form in the spirit, and the element had not yet been joined together. And know of a surety that the first part of creation was accomplished by the word of the power of the Son of God. For it was he who gave his Father his reason to create the spirits of all that exist. And it was he who in this way defined eternity, so that it is encompassed with the vision of the created purpose of each human soul, and all life in the midst of the being of God in his abode of Eldad is because of the gifts that he gave his Father. Now I am come to show you the second part of creation, for the Son of God loved his Father, and his love for his Father began to have an effect upon all the elements of the earth, and the love of Messiah for Sephora, in spite of her sins, wrought heavily upon all the elements of the earth, and it caused them to love one another, and to cling one another, and to change themselves in behalf of one another. And it came to pass that because of this the elements of the earth began to find form, and it was a love in spite of sin that gave them the great Holy One, that gave them form. The great Holy One could dwell in the element together with the soul of Sephora, who he put into all things. Wherefore, because of the Son, God could dwell in the midst of all that which he had created and made out of his love for Sephora. And the decrees of God created the Son to do this. It is known in heaven that when the Lord God creates life, it will have agency, and also during the course of probation, it will come about that each one will choose in turn to do which is contrary to the will of God, and for this reason the Son of God was prepared from before the foundation of the world to bring a blessing of forgiveness and purifying and cleansing from sin through the power of his compassion. Therefore, it took the power of the Son of God to give element form where God and man could dwell together. For God would not be able to dwell in the forms of element in the form that element take because of the love of his Son, except there was a way prepared to love mankind in spite of their sins, and the handiwork of the power of the Son in giving element form to be the bodies of the spirits of life that he had made also brought about form that the great Holy One could dwell in with sinful man, and thus the Father has an eternal home because of the power of the Son, and where he can dwell with the souls of man which he has made. And it came to pass that Achee saw the second part of creation, where all element found him from within the midst of eternity, where there is no time. And all the forms of the elements of the earth took naturally, was before Adam and his rib sinned, and time is a result of sin, and it has no place with God in Elda. But the power of the Son of God was such that it could join God with man in time and place. Nevertheless, all element found form outside of time, and the elements began to love one another and to be attracted to one another because of the power of the love of the Son. And all the spirits that God had made began to find a place to dwell in the midst of the forms of the element was taken under his loving hand, and the condition within which element found form cannot be measured in days or years or any kind of measure, for all element found form in the midst of the timeless of eternity, and this is because of the Son is eternal. And any man who will attempt to put time upon the formation of the element of the earth will be confused, for they were formed in eternity. And it came to pass that when all of the elements of creation had found their form, who had arrived at the state which they would be in for God and man to dwell in for them together, it was Olam. And in this way, the second part of creation was completed, and all creation was now in a natural state. A spirit and element were joined together by the handiwork of both the Father and the Son, and all was ready to be inhabited by man, and there was not yet a man to till the ground, for natural man did not eat, but only the food of the watchers. And the first of all, the first gift of Messiah gave to his father, was called Adam. A man was formed from the dust of the earth, and Messiah entered into him to give him the breath of life. And man became a living soul, and it is known in heaven that the spirit of the body together of the soul and man. And now the miracle of the element of finding form was very great in the eyes of all of those in heaven, for it allowed the great Holy One to dwell with sinful man in the midst of creation. And the greatness of this miracle cannot be fully known by man until he stands in the presence of God. And it came to pass that our old mother showed Achee that all of the spirits of God he made in his 6 days of pondering in the course of time took on a natural form, and all the multitudes of the individual spirits of life that sprang forth out of the great love of God had a distinct identity for a dwelling place in all of the forms of the elements that had taken. And remember that all these forms had the spirit of the man that the Father has put into them, and that they have the spirit of God that Messiah has put into them. And each of the watchers of heaven had these two spirits dwelling in them with their own. And after the second part of creation was completed, the spirit of the soul of God, and the spirit of the soul of man, and the spirit of all the souls of the Erkadarshi were now a part of the fabric of creation altogether. And Achee saw that before that day there were forms that the element that could and Achee saw that day that there were forms that element could take that came and went and were no more, for the spirit of man was not within them, but they were only a part of the element of finding the form it would take of creation to be complete. And when the elements had found the form they would be in, they would fully show forth the love of God for man, and Adam was called upon to name them. And it came to pass that Achee could see that the man who dwelt in Eden was called Adam, for God put him there before the element had reached its full form, and Achee knew that the third part of creation was about to commence. And the watcher who was filled with the feelings of the joining left, and another watcher who was filled with the feelings of compassion came and stood by Achee. And he said, "You have seen the great and the wondrous things of the love of God can accomplish to create all the spirits of all that exists. And you have seen the marvels of the love of the Son in bringing about the natural creation which is called Eden, that gave the souls of man and God and the Erkadarshi a dwelling place. And be it known that the Son of God entered into the souls of your first parents, and the act transformed the spiritual creation of Olam into the natural world of Eden. And look and see how this was assisted by the wonders of the doings of all the righteous among the children of man throughout the course of the earth. And it was affirmed and fixed by the third part of creation. And it came to pass that Achee listened, and he looked intently, and behold, all which would take place before him. And he saw Adam and his rib, and they sinned in the midst of Eden. And he saw that it was expedient for them to leave the natural world of Eden. And he knew that the spirit of the soul of God and the spirit of the soul of the man must inevitably part to separate from another when man sinned, because nothing unclean can enter into the presence of God. And he knew that it would be the man who would depart, as God is in the midst of all things, cannot go out to be absent there. And he knew that in this way all men will be forever lost, and except for the presence of the Messiah in element. For God and man and the Erkadarshi, for God and man and the Erkadarshi, there would not be means for them to dwell together in the face of sin. But when he beheld Adam and his rib sin, a very marvelous thing came before his eyes, for he saw that all the natural elements of creation followed after the man and the rib, to be transformed with them in the natural to the temporal. And when it was transformed in this way, it took the presence of the great Holy One into the fallen state of man onto the temporal earth. And the natural world of Eden became the temporal world of the earth in the sight, and in his sight. And Achee could plainly see that the darkness that covered the face of the deep kept man from beholding the very face of God, as he had done in Eden. For had they been able to choose to see beyond the veil of darkness they had covered the face of the deep, they would not have remained transformed into the temporal, but would have been transfigured and lived together. And it came to pass that Achee was greatly astonished that all the wonder of the rich purity of God who dwells in element, and the purity of the being state of each soul could still remain in their purity and dwell together in element, and that had been transformed from the element of the temporal because of sin. And he greatly marveled marveled that God with his transformation, the purity of neither God nor man, nor the Ergodershi was lost nor diminished, because of the utter completeness of the forgiveness of Messiah. And he saw that all the temporal element upon the earth still contained the utter purity of the vision of created purpose, and each and every human soul, in spite of its having been transformed into the temporal because of sin. And he saw that because of this, the souls of God and man and the Ergodershi would always dwell together in the elements of the earth, while man was in flesh and could not ever ever die, just simply because he was evil, no matter how evil he became. And this because of the infinite nature of the power of Messiah. And when he saw the miracle of it, exclaimed aloud, Shabua. And there arose immediately in heaven a numberless multitude of souls of men and the souls of all the Erkadershi, singing and praising God of Shabua. Because by Shabua, righteous man during all the course of the earth had placed and affirmed and decreed that Messiah with all his saving grace would be in the midst of all the elements together with man and God and the Erkadershi. And Shabua invited Messiah into the fourth spirit of life in all things, and Shabua keeps Messiah there. And these four spirits dwell inseparably together, because he is the way back to the Father for men when they sin, and for the way dwells with men because of Shabua and the glories of his ability to forgive and free to all the penitent and all who come to the love of repentance and find life eternal. By the endurance they can overcome their sin by their works of repentance and righteousness, to arise triumphant, to dwell with God and his Son in the natural world forever. And there was no man to till the ground. And there was no man to till the ground. Excuse me. And it came to pass that Achee looked upon the earth that lay before him out before the pinnacle that was stretched toward the west of his lair, and the sun was setting over the great sea, and he saw the earth in a way as if he had never seen it before, and the veil of his flesh was rent to the full, and Achee was transfigured before the Lord. And they spake again face to face, and he looked down, and he was holding the hand of his beloved Sephora, and they together stood before their lovely Messiah, and they did not know how long she had been there. And it came to pass that Sephora knew in her knowing that which had come to pass before the eyes of her husband from God. And when they returned to their lair, Padu beheld their faces of his parents shining with the light of presence of God. And after some days they took their laden kumas and went from off the high places to the east to return to the land of Tanim. End of chapter 5, second book of Achee.